Within the universe of JJK, there is an incredible amount of very powerful techniques. Black Flash, Blue and Red, Cursed Speech. But all of these abilities seem to pale in comparison to what is the holy grail of abilities within the JJK universe. And what would that holy grail be? Well, that holy grail would be the domain expansion. But what is a domain expansion? Why is it so powerful? Does it have drawbacks or countermeasures? Is there weaknesses in it? Well, that's largely dependent on who's casting it, but there is a set of universal rules that we'll go over in a second. But first, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And while we're supporting Nick, you guys can do that on two other YouTube pages. One is NCGamer23, where instead of talking anime, I play video games, and the second is Hammer's Collection, where instead of talking about anime, I unbox things from it. Before we get into all that, guys, today we have a brand new sponsor for the page. Brilliant. Listen, I don't know how many of you know that I used to be a biochemist. Long before I was talking about anime as a job, I worked in rare genetic diseases. I've even actually worked a job trying to cure cancer. And that's why I feel so passionately about today's sponsor, because Brilliant is a way for people to learn STEM interactively. STEM being science, technology, engineering, and math. I was only really good at that S part. But here's the thing, STEM plays a major role in my life to this day. Without stepping into the sciences, I never would be able to do the kind of research I do for videos right now. The drive and the passion it took me to understand STEM at the highest level is what now allows me to make Naruto and other anime videos easily. But I can tell you right now, my path to a master's degree in biotechnology would have been significantly easier if I had had Brilliant. Because something that Brilliant stands for, and something that I absolutely agree with, is that the easiest way to learn STEM is interactively. As somebody who has sat in quite literally hundreds of hours of STEM lectures, I couldn't agree with this more. Dealing with technology, dealing with science, dealing with engineering, dealing with mathematics, and getting your hands on it is absolutely the easiest way to learn. But I understand that STEM topics scare a lot of people. You hear about how scary organic chemistry is and you run away from it forever. But the beauty of Brilliant is that it has high versatility. You can learn at your own pace, you can learn on the go, you can learn something new every single day. There's no pressure to be me overnight. One day you could learn about evolution, and the next you could learn about Pythagorean theorems. But the key is that it's interactive and you'll have fun doing it. So if you want to feel more secure in STEM topics, or even have somebody in your life who you think could use a little boost, Brilliant is the perfect place. So guys, let's all up our STEM games with Brilliant. To get started for free, visit brilliant.org/nchammer23 or click the link in my description. The first 200 people to do this will get 20% off a premium subscription to Brilliant. Who knows, guys, with enough STEM knowledge, it might be you sitting in this seat eventually. So domain expansion, in the simplest terms, it's an advanced barrier technique. But it truly is much more than that. Essentially, a domain expansion is the manifestation of a user's innate domain. But what is an innate domain? Well, an innate domain, commonly referred to as just a domain, is basically your mental space. It's an area created in a user's mind, kind of like a reflection of your personality and everything you've ever done. The closest approximation I could use to explain this is thinking about either Rengoku or Tanjiro's reflections of their soul in the Mugen Train movie. Essentially, your innate domain is supposed to reflect your soul to a certain degree. And these innate domains can be expanded into a barrier. And those barriers can be one of two things, either finished or non-finished. A domain that is expanded without a barrier or any innate technique is usually considered unfinished. These domains can be huge, sprawling things that change the actual geography around them. But since there's no barrier, they're easy to get into, and technically easy to get out of. But only easy to get out of in the sense of talking about domain expansions, because a completed domain expansion is almost impossible to get out of. And these are domains that have been expanded with the use of a barrier technique or an innate technique. So let's get back to talking about these domain expansions. Domain expansions are primarily made to capture your enemy, more or less like a trap. And this domain expansion becomes a separate space with a wall to the outside world, making it almost impossible for the enemies trapped in said domain expansion to get out. But why use a domain expansion? Well, because within a domain expansion, the caster of the domain expansion's jujutsu abilities are significantly increased and their techniques can't miss. So essentially, once you catch somebody in your domain expansion, not only are your abilities stronger, you can hit every single one. But catching people in these barriers isn't necessarily easy. And even if you do catch somebody in this barrier, that doesn't mean your barrier will be complete immediately. Because even though the domain expansion is considered the highest of high when it comes to jujutsu abilities for jujutsu sorcerers, a domain expansion isn't considered complete until it fully embeds the caster's innate domain technique. Innate curse technique. But okay, that seems pretty simple. Essentially, you just have to do a hand sign in order to start your domain expansion. And if you get the person you're trying to trap in there, not only are you your Jujutsu ability stronger, you can't miss with them. And that domain expansion is just the projection of your soul, basically. And that's domain expansions on a base level. But there's also a lot of different types of domain expansions. There's lethal domains, non-lethal domains, and as we touched on before, incomplete domains. Lethal domains are the hardest to pull off of any of these domain expansions. They require almost the highest level of Jujutsu sorcery and an incredible amount of cursed energy. That's because these domains are created to kill. But the payoff for creating a domain such as this is high. Those can't miss techniques that I talked about earlier not only can't miss, but also can't be stopped. What do I mean by that? If, let's say, Gojo was cast into a domain expansion, a lethal domain expansion, and he had his ability Infinity activated. You know, his ability to infinitely slow anything that's approaching him down infinitesimally. Constantly approaching zero at a logarithmic rate. You get it. Even Gojo with that ability activated would not be able to stop a can't miss attack. Being caught in a lethal domain is exactly that. It's lethal. But fortunately for Gojo, in the modern Jujutsu world, most people can't use domain expansions. In fact, in both the anime and the manga, we've only ever seen 8 used. Almost all grade 1 sorcerers aren't able to do it. But just because every technique within a lethal domain expansion hits doesn't mean they're all deadly. That depends on the person launching attacks and the person defending against them. In fact, there's even a student at Jujutsu whose domain expansion has a sure hit function. However, when this sure hit attack hits you, it only transfers information to you from the attacker. And this is done as a trade-off to give the attacker faster activation speed on their other Jujutsu sorceries. It's like a buff. All right, that's lethal domains covered. Now let's talk non-lethal domains. You see, non-lethal domains kind of bring us into the conversation of why domains were created in the first place. In the olden days, hundreds of years before the timeline of Jujutsu Kaisen, non-lethal domains were created. They were essentially created to make sure that the people within the domain would obey the rules set by those who casted the domain expansion. And these rules were embedded into the curse technique of the domain expansion. The manga uses sumo wrestlers as an example for this. So think of the non-lethal domain expansion a bit like a referee. As the two sumo wrestlers are enveloped by the domain expansion, rules are now placed against them to make sure that they don't break them while wrestling. So while the sumo wrestlers can grab and slap each other, they can't gouge each other's eyeballs. And if they do, they would incur a curse technique penalty. It's kind of just like an omnipresent, omnipotent referee. But as time passed and people realized that domain expansions could be used for lethality, the users of domain expansions dwindled. Well, the users of non-lethal domain expansions dwindled. To this day in the manga, we actually see very few examples of non-lethal domain expansions. The only non-lethal domain expansion we truly see is much later down in the manga. And I'm not going to tell you who it belongs to, but I am going to explain how it works. The domain expansion is called Deadly Sentencing. And essentially, this non-lethal domain expansion creates a courthouse for the caster and the person caught in it to have a trial, like a traditional law and jury trial. There's no can't miss attacks in this domain. In fact, no violence is allowed whatsoever. The only truly weird thing about this courtroom is the fact that there's a shikigami, and that shikigami is called Judgement. Yeah, they didn't get super creative with that one. And as you are brought into this non-lethal domain expansion, Judgement then says all of the crimes of the person brought into it. So let's say you may or may not have committed murder. Judgement would announce to the crowd of 2 people there that you are standing here accused of murder. But here's the thing, Judgement is also the judge. And Judgement knows everything about the 2 people in the domain expansion immediately. So Judgement knows if you're guilty or not. Judgement doesn't share this information with the caster, which means that the only way that a verdict is made is based off the arguments of the 2 people in the courthouse. After Judgement says you stand here accused of murder, the defendant has 3 options: silence, confession, or denial. The one we're going to talk about is denial. If the person caught in the domain expansion decides to deny, they can lie. Their only goal is to dispel all doubt and be pronounced innocent by Judgement. So Judgement could say you stand here accused of murder, and you could say,
no, I didn't murder that person. I was with my mother all night.
Even if you weren't, even if you killed that person. And Judgement knows if you've killed that person, but it's about how good the argument you make is. And once the defendant has denied all charges, the prosecutor also gets a chance to speak. However, their argument is based off evidence that's given to them by Judgement in a sealed envelope. Now, this evidence is not conclusive. It's just enough for the prosecutor to make an argument. And once both sides have spoke, Judgement makes a lawful decision. Like, genuinely, it's usually pretty fair. And based off the severity of the crime, or whether or not the prosecutor or the defendant won, the charges are different. And here's the funny bit, the caster of the domain expansion isn't in charge of, well, the charges. And one charge that Judgement often lays down is confiscation, which stops the defendant from being able to use cursed techniques forever. And once the domain expansion expansion is dissolved, this happens to the defendant. But obviously, if you're proven innocent, then you just get to walk away or continue your fight. But if things get more serious and Judgement finds you guilty of something heinous, then it will be confiscation plus death penalty, where Judgement not only takes away your ability to use cursed techniques, but it also gives the user of the domain expansion a thing called the Executioner's Sword. And anyone cut by this Executioner's Sword even a little bit dies immediately. So in a sense, it is kind of a lethal domain, but it's not built specifically to kill, and therefore it falls into the non-lethal camp. And then lastly, we have a category that we touched on in the beginning of the video, incomplete domains. These are domain expansions built without a barrier. These domains cannot guarantee you a hit when you use your Jujutsu techniques. Jujutsu is very hard to say fast, but within these incomplete domains, the caster of the incomplete domain does have their Jujutsu abilities significantly strengthened. And that's basically it when it comes to incomplete domains. But a lot of these domains sound too good to be true. I mean, deadly sentencing can quite literally take away somebody's Jujutsu abilities or give the user a sword that one teensy little scratch from will kill their opponent. But there is drawbacks to the domain expansion. Most of the fact that domain expansions take an insane amount of cursed energy to create. And let's say hypothetically you try to use your domain expansion, but your opponent dodges it, well, there goes your battery, bud. In fact, the only person on Earth who's considered to be able to use a domain expansion multiple times in one day is Gojo. Well, I guess technically there is one other person who can cast it multiple times in one day, but there's like a whole activation sequence they have to go through to perfectly pull it off. And after casting a domain expansion, users won't be able to use their innate techniques for a small time after. What do I mean by that? So let's say Gojo creates his domain expansion. For a small time after the creation of his domain expansion, even if the barrier is not complete or it's not a complete domain, he won't be able to use Infinity or Red and Blue. I mean, he's probably an exception to the rule for being entirely real, but I'm just trying to use him as a frame of reference. But basically, there's a time period after creating a domain expansion that the user isn't able to use Jujutsu sorceries. And if they try to, it'll fail and evaporate. But okay, the domain expansion is incredibly powerful, even though it does have some drawbacks. Well, let's say hypothetically you or I gets pulled into somebody else's domain expansion. Are we dead? Well, I mean, probably, but there is countermeasures. Specifically, the things that you and I should try to have countermeasures against is the sure hit attacks within a domain expansion. See, there's a couple of ways to stop a sure hit attack within a domain expansion. It can be stopped with a blast of cursed energy. So let's say a sure hit arrow is flying at you. If you blast it with a blast of cursed energy, that can stop it. However, this requires incredibly precise cursed energy control. The true best way to stop a sure hit attack is an anti-domain barrier. Well, this is at least for people who can't cast their own domains. But what is an anti-domain barrier? Well, there's technically two things that are an anti-domain barrier that we know of thus far. The two things that we've seen act as anti-barrier domains are Hollow Wicker Basket and Simple Domain. But within the circumstance of defense from a domain, they operate exactly the same. Both Simple Domain and Hollow Wicker Basket create a simple domain around the caster. And in both circumstances, this domain is an orb. This Simple Domain or Hollow Wicker Basket then neutralizes the domain's innate cursed technique, nullifying its ability to make a guaranteed hit. Essentially, both of these techniques get rid of the cursed technique within the domain expansion itself. And then, since the cursed technique of the caster is no longer embedded in the domain, a sure hit is no longer guaranteed. However, these two abilities do not stop any actual cursed techniques. They just make it so you can avoid them. So both Hollow Wicker Basket and Simple Domain aren't really that effective in non-lethal or incomplete domains. Because let's say within the confines of deadly sentencing, if you tried to use a simple domain, it wouldn't stop the Executioner's Sword. Now, if this was a lethal domain where Executioner's Sword was a sure hit, it would make you able to dodge it. But let's say the caster of deadly sentencing just outmaneuvers you and still hits you with it, well then, GG's. That's only for people who can't do their own domain expansions. The best defense against a domain expansion is casting your own domain expansion. And if your domain is more refined than the other caster's domain, then your domain will win. But what if you don't have any of those things? Well, escaping a barrier-made domain expansion is almost impossible. But that doesn't mean you can't get out. All you need is a friend, because the harder it is to get out of a domain expansion, the easier it is to get in. Essentially, the more reinforced the domain expansion is from the inside, i.e. you can't get out of it, the more fragile it becomes, i.e. you can get into it from the outside. And this is why Itadori is able to break into Mahito's domain expansion. And that's basically everything you need to know about domain expansions. But in order to drive the point home, let's quickly touch on every domain expansion we've seen within the anime. The first domain expansion we see is Malevolent Shrine, and this belongs to Sukuna. This is a terrifying start to the list. You see, Malevolent Shrine effectively hits with anything within the domain expansion with slashing attacks. Anything within the domain expansion, be it a curse or a human, with cursed energy is hit with an ability called Cleave. And all inanimate objects like rocks or buildings or something like that are destroyed with an ability called Dismantle. Effectively, if you are within the Malevolent Shrine, which has a range of 200 meters around Sukuna, you're destroyed, be you alive or not. After Sukuna, we saw Jogo's domain expansion. Jogo's domain expansion is called Coffin of the Iron Mountain, and against your average person, this would be an incredibly daunting domain. Essentially, once trapped within a domain expansion, it becomes so hot that your average sorcerer would combust into flames. And within the domain, Jogo can control all of the fire using his pyrokinesis. But on top of that, he can also control all of the earth within the volcano that he spawns you into, effectively making him a lava bender within a volcano. And he's the only person with immunity to heat. But shortly after we saw Jogo's domain expansion, we saw Gojo's domain expansion. And Gojo's domain expansion is terrifying. Everything about Gojo is infinite, limitless, if you will. And his domain expansion fits that vibe. See, his domain expansion is called Unlimited Void. This traps his target within the limitless. A void filled with infinite information. However, upon having infinite information poured into their head, the person caught in the domain expansion becomes immobile. So Gojo can just rip your head off your shoulders. The next domain expansion we saw was much lesser explained. It's further explained later on in the manga, but we've seen it in the anime. That domain expansion is Dagon's domain expansion. And this domain expansion is called Horizon of the Captivating Skanda. Essentially, this domain expansion is a vast beach with a ton of water. And within this domain expansion, Dagon can control all of the water, basically an ocean's worth, as well as being able to control several dozen fish Shikigami. For those of you who don't remember, Shikigami are familiar curses, like the ones that Megami summons. After Dagon, we have Mahito. Mahito awoke to his domain expansion while in a fight with Nanami and Itadori. And his domain expansion is very humbly called the self-embodiment of perfection. Mahito's domain expansion works kind of oddly. Essentially, it ties into Mahito's ability Idle Transfiguration, which allows Mahito to control the shape and size of somebody's soul. And by controlling the shape and size of their soul, changing their body as well. But in order to do this, Mahito has to be touching you. But within his domain expansion, which is entirely made of his hands, he's touching everybody, which means that the second you're within Mahito's domain expansion, he's touching you directly on your soul, which means just like with Gojo's domain expansion, it is basically an instant win for him. As long as you are caught in it, you are most likely dead, because within the confines of that domain expansion, he can just change your soul to whatever he wants it to be, which could either deform you into some kind of monster or just straight up kill you. And then the last domain expansion that we saw in the anime is from Megami. Now, Megami's domain expansion is incomplete. It has no barrier. However, that doesn't mean it's not incredibly powerful. Essentially, Megami is able to summon a massive field of shadows. And from these shadows, he can summon hundreds of Shikigami. On top of these Shikigami, he's able to manipulate the shadows to basically be whatever he needs them to be. A spike, a shield, a projectile, you name it, he can probably do it with shadows. And that's it. Everything that you need to know about domain expansions up to this point in the anime. If you guys like this little explanation, please tell me in the comments below. And while you're down there, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Listen, I'm not saying that I want to be putting Gojo's domain expansion, but as long as he doesn't rip your head off your shoulders, you're probably gonna learn a thing or two.